Thanks for your patience.
No, not a problem. Glad we made it work. Nobody knows what we went through. That's what matters. If it's not Milwaukee traffic, it's a software, whatever it is.
So you just run the little, not your PowerPoint, the other PowerPoint
Okay.
online, and then I'll hit the bumper and we'll get it.
It must have been beautiful driving.
Oh, it was amazing. I think after Milwaukee it was actually sunny. So it was very nice. Yeah, the last stretch was really sunny.
Is Beloit a lot of crime, or did they give it up?
Well, it's one of the ongoing issues. Fortunately, most of the crime is very mild. It's not very serious.
Okay, we lived there for 1 year.
Really?
Yep, they shot that little boy, that little Mexican boy.
Mhm.
Oh, that was brilliant.
Oh, that was like 10 years ago, right? Yes.
Yeah, we did last president year.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then they tied up AT&T store. They tied them up with those not twist ties, whatever they are, zip ties.
Mhm.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for sitting through the technical difficulties that we had going on, but we finally got both screens up. Before we get going, as usual, I would like to thank our sponsors for the Great Decisions Lecture Series. And without them, as you know at this point, none of this would be possible. And including the screens, which should be better by next week. In theory, that's what they tell me. But regardless, we got them going. Professor Toral had to deal with Milwaukee traffic. I had to deal with technical issues. But in the end, it all worked out. So a huge thank you to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Potts Christie, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for our sponsors as always. I'm going to turn things over to Professor Toral almost immediately. Just want to call two things to your attention. If you're in the mood for something a little bit lighter than economic warfare, I don't know why you would be, but in case you are, this Thursday at 5 p.m., we're showing the 1980s classic, The Breakfast Club, right here in the same room. Hopefully the screens will be working better for that at the start of it. And then just wanted to call your attention and remind you that we once again have the Seed Library at Manitowoc Public Library, which opened this past Saturday. And you can take up to 4 packs of seeds for gardening free of charge every visit to the library. It's located on the first floor. It's the only card catalog that's on the first floor anymore. So should be easy to locate. But if you have any questions at all, just go to the service desk and they'll be more than happy to help you. And really, without further ado, once we get to questions and answers, Linda?
Please silence the cell phone.
Oh, please silence your cell phones. I actually thought you were saying someone left their cell phone. But just silence them. I won't take your cell phone. All right, well, Linda, who was kind enough to point that out, also will be walking around with the microphone during question and answers. If you're watching online, type your comments and questions in on the comment box on either Facebook or YouTube, and we'll get to them at the end of the lecture. So, without further ado, Professor Pablo Toral.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim, for your kind introduction. Thank you to the sponsors, and thank you all for being here. I know the weather hasn't been ideal for the last few days, but it certainly was ideal as I was coming here. After Milwaukee, the sun came out. It was just beautiful, blue skies, sunny, dry road, and beautiful snow. Last time I came, we had more snow than you did. Like statistic, now you have more than we do. It's a tie. 1-1. Okay. So I also have a disclaimer on colorblind. So a friend of mine always tells me sometimes you need to explain about your clothes. So I color code my clothes and then I take what's up next. So this has nothing to do with the topic of the conversation today. So it was just the next one up in my wardrobe. So I will get started with the topic of the week. I really want to thank you for coming again and for inviting me for a second time. When the organizers reached out to me, I gave them a few topics that I was very comfortable speaking about. I study political economy. This is political economy. I study the environment as well. And the topic that I presented on about a month ago was bringing the two together. Today is mostly about political economy. So without further ado, I'm gonna dive into my slides. I have lots of slides, but most of them have very little text. I include some key concepts that I'm using, some that are used in the reading. I always like to start by talking a little bit about the reading and then go off and provide my own analysis. So I know that you always like me to have a biographical slide here. So this is who I am, Professor of International Relations and Environmental Studies at Beloit College. And as I mentioned, I teach political economy and the environment. And I'm currently working on a couple of books on those topics. So I'm hoping to get them done before the end of the year. And Jonathan Chaniz is the person who wrote the essay that some of you probably read already. His background is as an asset manager. Runs his own company, but he has a lot of teaching experience and research experience regarding political economy at different schools. So it's a very informed person with a very good analytical view. So it's also a treat to get an opportunity to read his analysis. So I'm going to open by giving you the structure and the goals of my presentation before I dive in. First, the goals. I always like to start by defining key technical terms that appear in the reading and a few others that I will include in my presentation. I will then provide an overview of trade policy for the US and some key players, China, Russia, and the European Union in particular, which are some of the key trade partners or key players at the WTO, the World Trade Organization. I will then talk about whether it really facing a turning point. This is not something that the author is bringing up in the article, but this is something that I really want to toss out there for us to think about. Last time I was here, I told you that we're without a doubt going through an energy transition. Now the question is, this is an open-ended question. I can't say that this is a fact, but are we going through a realignment of global markets? And based on what we've seen the last couple of years, there is some suggestions that we might be, but we need a little bit of a broader perspective to be able to confirm that that's the direction we're going. But I will point out a few bits of information that suggest that we might be going in that direction. So I will conclude with a few questions, and then we'll open it up for discussion. To do all of these, I divided the presentation in 5 parts. I will open with a summary explaining why it matters. It's always important to know the relevance of the topic that we study. Then we'll define the topic, economic warfare. Then we'll move on to talk about the key principles of international political economy and international trade in particular, since economic warfare is a violation of those principles. So it's important for us to know what we're violating by engaging in economic warfare. Then we'll do case studies. By case studies, we mean look at specifics of different actors. I mentioned the US, China, Russia, and the European Union, and then we'll wrap it up with some conclusion. So, first section, why does it matter? Why does economic nationalist, economic warfare in particular matter? One of the reasons is because what we see is a politicization of trade. Trade is politics. We're using an economic arena for political means to pursue political goals. We've seen this before. This is not new. We saw that in 1973 when the oil embargo really brought the world economy to a major crisis. And we also saw that in 2013. We saw that in 2020 with COVID, the pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these are different world events that normally lead to a major changes in policy, some of them economic, some of them security. And the emphasis on security and economy are really critical to understand what we mean by the weaponization of trade or economic warfare. So normally, as I mentioned, when there is a major global crisis, we see big changes in policy. And that happens at the global level, but it also happens at the domestic level. Just as an example, and before we get into the specifics of where we are today, you know, the collapse of the stock exchange in the 1920s that led to an economic crisis in the 1930s led to a very significant change in the way that we approach trade in this country. The 19th century was an age of free trade where the US traded globally for the most part, and with the collapse of the stock exchange, of a number of measures to try to revitalize the economy, the US engaged in a form of economic nationalism, as did other countries of the world, and that brought what some historians call the greatest age of globalization, the 19th century, to an end. We then began a period of economic nationalism, economic protectionism that lasted until World War II. And after the end of World War II, the US with the UK and their allies decided that it was a good idea to open up everyone's economy, to work together, and that led to a growing process of opening and globalization again, which leads to the second decade of this 21st century, when we seem to see a reversal of roles, in particular because of the rise of a couple of countries, mostly China, that don't necessarily play by the rules of free trade. So that's the backdrop to this. So then I think my computer just froze. Sorry, let me see if I can. Okay, found a way. Okay. So I guess it's different key every minute. All right. So the second section is a definition of what we mean by economic warfare. So let's get into that. So normally by that we mean the adoption of hostile measures, economic measures, attacks, some scholars would say, by a country against another country, or by a group of countries against a country, or by a group of countries against a group of countries. So normally, this does not lead to an escalation to war, to military means, but sometimes it does. Sometimes there is a use of military means to achieve economic goals. We see that, for example, with attacks against the Iranian nuclear program, which Iran claims they're doing that for civil reasons, and those who attack the nuclear program claim that it's not so clear. The main goal is to undermine the adversary, the target country, and their political will and their capacity to implement certain policies that the aggressor does not believe should be implemented. So the idea is to make them, give them incentives to change the course of action. During World War II, economic warfare was very, very openly done by the countries involved in the war. In fact, many countries created a ministry of economic warfare. After the end of the Cold War and during the Cold War, after the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War, many countries decided to keep using those measures. They internalized them into a regular ministry, Ministry of the Economy, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And normally they take this shape of sanctions. The idea that some kind of asset that a country might need that we decide not to share with them. That's what we normally mean by sanctions. The US has done that very regularly, but mostly by withdrawing access to key technology for military and security purposes. So normally we see these two aspects going together. Making it very difficult, if not impossible, for a target country to access technology that they might use for military means or for unfair economic competition that might work against the US. Normally, when the US engages these policies, they claim they do so for national security. Whenever we talk about national security, we talk about a threat, an existential threat to an aspect of American economy, American society. So if there is an existential threat, then we actually invoke the adoption of extraordinary measures. And I really want to emphasize this because we have rules that apply under regular conditions that should be respected according to the international community. But when a country claims that their national security is threatened, they actually argue that they need to adopt extraordinary measures. And economic warfare is one of those extraordinary measures. Okay. The Soviet Union during the Cold War was the main target, not the only one, but the main target. And the goal was to keep them from adopting or getting access to American technology that they could use for satellite technology for the development of the space program or for other military means. China is now becoming the main target of those economic sanctions. Okay, what are the advantages of it? We wouldn't do it if it didn't pay dividends. One of the advantages is that it inflicts pain, economic pain on other countries. It makes living standards harder. It makes life harder for those that receive those sanctions. The second one is that it normally does not escalate. It doesn't escalate into a military war. So it's a form of warfare that normally doesn't cause casualties by the use of weapons. And I say normally because there's some studies that show that economic warfare does cause death. It causes a lot of pain, not necessarily by weapons, but it's what a Norwegian scholar, Johan Galtung, calls structural death. We can kill people without touching them, but depriving them of access to health when they need it, to food, and to other things. And it's also very affordable. Any of us could do economic warfare. Countries can do economic warfare very differently. The countries that have the more resources can probably engage more aggressive economic warfare, but any country can do that, and all it takes is to deny any country in the world access to a resource that you have. And that in itself is economic warfare. What are some of the disadvantages? One of them is effectiveness. It is effective, it's easy to inflict a certain amount of pain on your opponent, but it's not so clear that leads to the change of policy that economic warfare seeks to achieve. So pain does not necessarily mean to a change of national policies. So from that perspective, it misses the intended goal. The second one is, in particular, the kind of economic warfare that we're talking about today is that it can lead to what economists call decoupling or deglobalization. The idea that some of the key markets in the world might actually start moving in different directions, particularly the US in one direction and China in a different direction. And economists don't think that's a very good idea. One of the reasons why inflation has been very low between the 1990s and pretty much last decade is because of China joining the WTO. By having China join and having free trade with China, China became into a gigantic sweatshop that produced lots of cheap goods that we benefited from, and that really increased our living standards by keeping inflation to key products low. Computers, clothing, some machines, etc. So if we really are moving in the direction of decoupling, we should be prepared to see higher inflation rates in the future. And that really has an impact on every person's life, particularly the poor. Normally, inflation, if we decouple from China, we'll see inflation increase. And the more we break away from China, the more inflation will increase, because that means we're going to have to look for another sweatshop or any other places where you can produce things cheaply. And if we can't do that, then inflation will increase, and inflation is a tax on the poor. So we'll see how poverty will probably increase in around the world. Another one is the human impact. And I mentioned that Johan Galtung said, the Norwegian scholar, that economic sanctions kill without necessarily firing a weapon. If you deny certain countries access to certain goods, you can really kill people. The US, for example, passed an embargo against Iraq in the 1980s, 1990s, against Iran as well. And part of the embargo was denying them access to some medical goods, which, according to some scholars, cost the lives of about 250,000 people. In part due to poor sanitation, also due to poor access to healthcare. Those figures are always very difficult to prove. This is some hypothesis, so we don't know exactly what is the number. We don't know how many of those deaths were the result of bad domestic policy. But by denying, it's clear that by denying Iran and Iraq access to some goods that were coming from the US, certainly conditions changed. Another one, and this is something that is argued here, is constitutional breach. The economic warfare is done by the executive without any members of the legislative branch knowing this, in part because it's secretive. I mean, normally don't tell China that cyber attack is happening tomorrow. It just happens. To prevent a leak, normally the executive will issue the order to the right department that will then get the work done. So some people claim this is a breach of power by the executive. They can get away with some policies that the legislative might not necessarily think is a good idea. Okay, so we learned what it is, the positives and the negatives. So now let's talk about what are the key rules of international political economy. As I mentioned, normally economic warfare is used when we claim that a national security is under threat, which means we call for extraordinary measures, a violation of normal measures, the laws of peace, if you will. Normally we have the laws of peace, the laws of war. When you declare war, then the laws of war kick in, but you're not allowed to use those until you're legally in a war. So that's a metaphor that, in a way, can help us understand how economic warfare works. So what are the rules of international political economy? So the rules of international trade and investment are pretty much set after World War II by the US, the UK, and their allies. And it was informed by the idea of avoiding protectionism. As I mentioned earlier, the crisis in 29 led to a period of economic protectionism and economic nationalism in the 30s, which some scholars claim led to the rise of Nazi Germany, that and many other things. But the idea is that if we really need to move away from that, the world has to come together rather than grow apart. So the more we engage with one another, the more we'll know one another. So it's good for everyone. We'll build certainty rather than uncertainty. We'll know what the others are doing, and that will make the world more predictable, which is something that we want. We humans create predictability. We want to make sure that when we leave this room, there'll be transportation for us to get home. We'll get home safely. So if that is not guaranteed, then some people are not going to come to the talk. For example, that's a way of phrasing this. And these goals of international trade are internalized into the national legislation of each country. International law is above national law. When countries agree to sign an international treaty, they sign it and they have to agree to comply with it, which means that there has to be a law domestically by which every member of the society agrees to comply with it. So the key legislation in domestic trade, of the role that the US has to play in trade, is pretty much what we have on the board right now. These are 4 really important pieces of legislation. We mentioned the 1930s, the Smoot-Hawley Act is the one that increased taxes on the importation of goods, which caused incredible decoupling of the economies of the world. And And the result of that led to a new law in 1934, the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, which gives the president some power to eliminate some of the tariffs that we set on imported goods. And one of the reasons for that is because after passing the Smoot-Hawley Act, we realized that just like our exports were going down, imports were going down, but exports were going down as well. So we were too involved with the world economy that we couldn't just break away from it. So we had to come up with a way to have the cake and eat it too, which is always very difficult to do. So as we move into the 1950s and 70s, this approach gets consolidated, the idea that we want to give ourselves some tools to engage in protectionism when we want it, but we also have to give the president the tools to avoid protectionism when it's not good for us. And that's part of the problem, that we're giving the president powers that then the president exercises and then the legislative doesn't like it. But that's exactly what the law says. 1975 fast track is a really important one because it gives the president the power to basically sign into law any trade deal with any country that comes out of the legislature without any amendment. So whatever comes out when the president signs it cannot be amended. So it really forces discussions to happen and to basically put something on paper that we all agree with that will pass very quickly. But in essence, the idea is we want the US to have access to free trade, free investment around the world. We want to give ourselves a clause, a way out in case conditions change so that we can do that. And pretty much every country has that. So the system of international trade and investment is informed by political liberalism, which is the political system that informs the US, the British political system, many British former colonies. The idea is that the market normally does it better, so the government shouldn't interfere too much. The government should only come in to correct when the market fails. There's a preference for multilateralism. The idea is that signing a free trade agreement between two countries and then another country and then another country is incredibly time-consuming and it is very expensive. So if we can create an international organization that by joining everybody agrees to free trade, then the job is done. So we call that multilateralism, having different countries work together. Another principle is legalism. If we really believe this, we should put it on paper, we should pass the law, ratify it, and abide by it. So these are critical principles of international political economy. Trade in particular, many of the measures that we qualify as economic warfare are mostly trade. And trade in particular is very difficult to negotiate. Since World War II, we are still negotiating rules to open up trade around the world. So a lot has happened since the 1940s. The world markets are more open, but we're not there yet. So we're still negotiating. The way it works is that countries give themselves a number of years to negotiate what we call single undertaking, a basket of goods and services. Countries will put some in a basket, and we agree that we will negotiate until we have an agreement on free trade on that basket. And that basket might include corn that some countries will put in it. It might include software that some countries might want to put in it. It might include cars that some countries might want to put in it. And as you can expect, some countries are more competitive than others at producing cars. So they will want free trade, but not the ones who are not very good at it. Those who produce corn more cheaply will want a system of free trade, but the ones who are not very good at it probably will not, because that could have an impact on their local corn industry. But if countries have to negotiate individually, item by item, they will never have an agreement. And that's what we do the single undertaking. Everybody has to give something up. We know that in a system of international trade, those who do better will probably do even better yet. If we open up, they will be increasing their markets and their exports. But that also means that the world will benefit as a result because we'll have access to better, cheaper goods of a particular type. The second one is consensus. If you join the WTO and you agree to these rules, single undertaking, that means that we negotiate until everybody agrees. There is no veto power, there is no dissenting opinion, so we all keep talking until we have consensus. Another thing we need to agree to is that sometimes there might be some disputes once the law is in place, and we have to agree to a third party to arbitrate, to settle a dispute. For that reason, we create international trade courts, international courts for investment. So international courts that are staffed by very competent lawyers that have background in the topics that the issue areas that the courts are meant to adjudicate. And we appoint those people on the basis of their credentials. They're not instructed. They don't answer to any country. They're just there because they're the best in the trade. So that's another rule that's very important. International trade and investment are supposed to run on almost nothing. Very small bureaucracy. They're based on the compliance of the member countries, so that we don't have to have an army of law enforcement to make countries comply. To make sure that things go smoothly, all member countries agree to meet on a regular basis, and those meetings can be very, very regular. Sometimes they're not if we don't make enough progress. Normally, the baskets that are discussed are divided up into three types of baskets. Goods, physical stuff that can be put in a container shipped. Services, things that come out of your brains. For example, somebody can hire you as a consultant to give someone advice on something that you know very well about. And then intellectual property. So yesterday was Hollywood night, Oscars, so it would be Hollywood, Bollywood for India. Okay. Having said that, those are the written rules. But there's also some unwritten rules that the US and the European Union are the countries that created the system, that have the most at stake to keep it running, and they normally know how things work. They normally play the role of leaders. So they're the ones that normally will bring everybody together and make sure that we all go in the same direction. However, that is not to say that there are not other countries that play a very important role. Normally, Brazil has taken it upon itself to stand up to the US and the European Union as a defender of low-income country. So normally, you'll have the European Union, the US, and Brazil producing more than 95% of the litigation that happens in the court. The reason for that is normally US and the European Union will sue each other, and then Brazil will sue all of the above. Brazil will do it not necessarily in the name of Brazil, but they'll do it because think about any small country in Latin America, Asia, or Africa will have problems with something. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the money, so they basically call Brazil and say, we have a problem with this. And Brazil will say, don't worry, I'll take them to court. So normally those are the three countries that are the leaders. And the system seems to work very well. China is starting to generate some significant litigation, so these might actually change. But in general, US, EU lead, they sue each other, and then Brazil sues on behalf of pretty much the rest of the world. Okay, so what are those institutions that we have created to oversee these rules? The first one was the International Trade Organization. That was the organization that was going to be created after World War II to enforce the rules of free trade. However, the US did not ratify, so it never got built. Instead, we created a system, an ongoing system of conversations, negotiations, one that was not run by a particular organization. The organization never got created, called a GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the point of this agreement is to have countries meet regularly to lower tariffs, to talk and talk and talk and talk until out of boredom they would agree that it was time to bring down tariffs in particular, but all kinds of limitations to trade. There are a few principles that all countries that join these talks have to agree with. One of them is the most favored status. Any member country that joins the international trade regime agrees to give any goods and services coming from other country equal treatment. It's a non-discrimination clause. Just because your corn is produced in Canada doesn't mean you can discriminate against it. If you want the Canadians not to discriminate against American corn, then you can't discriminate against Canadian corn. So that is the idea, non-discrimination, most favored. So the rules that apply to US corn in the US have to apply to Canadian corn. Another one is reciprocity. So if the US does that, Canada should do it as well. So that's very clear. Prohibition on non-tariff barriers. Sometimes tariff barrier means a tax. When you cross the border, there is an excise tax of 5% on this particular issue. That is not a good idea if you want free trade, but at least it's a very visible idea. What happened is many countries try to engage in protectionism by coming up with health requirements. For example, the case of GMOs. The idea that American beef cannot be sold in Europe because it is GMO in Europe, that is not allowed. So that shuts out American meat. So the US sued the European Union over this. The argument by Europe is that GMOs are not healthy. The WTO has some clauses that allow for the violation of free trade for issues of health, social concerns. But the EU could not produce any evidence that GMO meat is less healthy than organic meat. So on those grounds, the EU lost, and now Americans can export their meat. So that's a non-tariff barrier. The idea that the countries can come up with health requirements that would allow them to shut out products from other countries. So the WTO doesn't want that because those are difficult to see. Final is safeguards. Countries can actually suspend free trade temporarily over matters of national health crisis, social crisis, political crisis, upheaval, war, a number of options. So these are a few clauses that you can use to get out, but they have to be very extraordinary. They're hardly ever invoked. And the final principle is that the market is the market. The government should not manipulate the market, should not intervene. The role of the government is to sign free trade agreements and then let society produce and trade the corn or the meat or whatever people want to ship across borders. So how does the GATT work? Well, it works very slowly, and the result of GATT is actually very, very clear. As I mentioned, with China joining in the 1990s, we all benefited from a significant period of about 2 decades of low prices, but that took a lot of work. So countries send a representative to a meeting, and the meetings will open up. The conversations will start, they'll be given a name, and the conversations will end when those baskets are finished. Remember those 3 baskets: goods, services, intellectual property. So at the beginning, there will be an agreement of what we put in the basket, and we'll converse until we agree to liberalize trade on those. The first round was led by President Kennedy of the US, and it's known as the Kennedy round, when he brought member countries to the US and said, we really need to lower tariff barriers by 35%. That was one of the big ideas. Another important aspect that came out of the Kennedy round is that the adoption of anti-dumping measures. The idea is that no country can produce below the cost of production of a particular good and then dump it on another country to kill production there. So that when the industries go out of business, they can jack up the price. That was standard practice at the time. So those are the 2 key results coming out of the Kennedy round. The second one was led by the government of Japan. So the Japanese government brought all countries that were willing to participate to Tokyo in 1973. Between 1973 and 79, they basically filled up baskets, and they began to discuss new baskets. One of the results of that is that the U.S. gave the president fast track authority. The idea was that having to pass legislation on all of these items could take forever, and the U.S. might find it very difficult to honor its international commitments, which would cause other countries to retaliate against the U.S. by not opening up their economies to American exports. So for that reason, the fast track authority was given to the U.S. Another one was the reduction of import tariffs, 35% from low-income countries. So the U.S. and other high-income countries could not agree on by how much to lower import tariffs, but they did agree that they needed to help low-income countries. So they all agreed that countries whose GDP per capita is below a certain bar would have preferential access to the markets of the US and Europe in particular. Okay, a final argument is what we call the infant industry argument. The idea that countries that might want to develop a new industry probably have the right to protect it. So let's say that if the US wants to come up with a new industry for microchips, microprocessors, which is one of the growing concerns right now, the US should have the right to protect its industry until it is commercially viable, so that it grows and it doesn't get decimated by cheaper imports from China. So that's a very important clause when countries want to develop into new industries and diversify. In the 1980s, the government of Uruguay took the lead and invited people to Montevideo to continue to discuss. And what's interesting about the Uruguay round is that we have TRIPS, intellectual property. Until then, we're really opening up the export of goods. Now we're talking about the export of intellectual property. Architects, accountants, scientists, people who make a living not from making things but by ideas. They really wanted all kinds of protection so they could sell their ideas to other countries without those ideas being stolen. And there was a big demand by the US and the European Union. Low-income countries and middle-income countries agreed to those guarantees on the grounds that the US and the European Union stop subsidizing their farmers. Because the idea is we don't have money, our governments don't have money, we can't subsidize our farmers. If you subsidize those, we can't grow food. If we can't grow food, we're at the mercy of your weather in the Midwest. So that's not good for our survival. So this is a matter of national security. So that has been a very complicated matter because the US and the European Union have agreed to lower farms subsidies. They have to do that very creatively because if they don't do it, then low-income and middle-income countries do not agree to further liberalization. But if they open up and eliminate those subsidies, then many presidents will never get elected if they run on that platform. They probably won't win Wisconsin. And finally, in 1993, the World Trade Organization was created. For the first time, we have an organization that actually has a secretariat, a few people whose job it is to collect all of the bodies of legislation and to make sure that they keep track of where the conversations are and where they need to go. And now we are under the Doha round. So, in 2001, Doha was the place where further conversation happened. Not a lot of progress has been made precisely on the farm subsidies. Low-income, middle-income countries are not willing to make concessions if the US and Europe and Japan and others are not willing to lower their subsidies because they claim we can't compete. I mean, you're fully subsidized. Our governments don't have the money. We don't get subsidized. How can we possibly compete? How is that fair trade? They're really holding further progress on other industrial goods. And by arguing that we cannot guarantee that we won't steal the technology in your goods if we buy them, they're putting pressure on the high-income countries on their farm subsidies. And that's the back and forth that we're witnessing. And for the US, that's not a very easy argument. It's not a very good situation because they don't want to stop subsidizing food in the US, in part because farmers vote, they elect presidents, too, because you don't want to be fully dependent on the food of other countries in case they engage in economic warfare. Look what's going on in the UK. The UK left the European Union, but has no trade agreement with any country. So when there is a food shortage, there's nobody else coming to give them food. So right now they're rationing food, some types of food. I didn't know that for the British tomatoes is such a big thing. People are fighting over tomatoes. Okay, so this is a problem. It's a real problem. We assume that whatever we find on the shelves is there because it's always been there, but it's only there because we have a free trade agreement with a country that agrees to put it there. But in exchange for that, we have to buy things. We have to send them things to them. So it's very complicated. So, and let's hope that the British can find their tomatoes wherever they are. Okay, regionalism. And this is getting us closer to where I think the future is. Economic warfare is probably moving us away from globalization into regionalism. And regionalism is not anything new. Regionalism is the idea that sometimes dealing with your neighbors is better, it's easier, even if you don't like them that much, than dealing with countries on the other corner of the world. At least they're close, you know what they're doing, sometimes they leave the windows open, so you can peek in, so that's not too bad. So we know what they like that we don't, they know what we like that they don't, and then we can find ways to accommodate. Another reason why regionalism is on the rise is because the US is a big economy, but if the US negotiates international trade agreements along with Canada and Mexico, then they are significantly bigger. So they're taken more seriously by other countries, and many smaller countries are coming together, creating regional economic blocs and negotiating with other countries as bloc. For example, the Central American Common Market is a market of about 45 million people. But if you were to negotiate with Nicaragua, we're really talking about a country of about 4 million. So many countries will not even, Nicaragua is about 5 to 6. So many, and low income. So many countries will not bother to negotiate a free trade agreement with Nicaragua. Say, too bad, find what you need wherever you can find it. But by being part of the Central American Common Market, now Nicaragua plus Costa Rica plus Panama plus the Dominican Republic plus Guatemala and other countries, now they are really a bigger market and they're taken seriously by many others. So we see that. Another reason why regionalism is important is because in spite of how far globalization has gone, about half, 43%, almost half of world's trade happens within regions. So the US buys most of what it needs from Canada and Mexico, more than from other countries around the world. So Mexico, for example, is one of Wisconsin's top 3 markets. If Mexico stopped buying, a third of our exports would disappear. So imagine the impact that would have on the Wisconsin economy. So Canada is very important as well. How do international blocs get established? How do they work? I'm getting a little bit into economic science here. So there is a couple of schools. There's many more schools, but there's a couple that I will give you here, and I will keep this part short because it's very theoretical. The idea is the functionalist approach. The idea is that we actually trade with others because once you learn that one country has something that you really, really like, you ask them, what else do you have? It's like going to the store. You go to the store to get one thing and you go, well, if you can get this other thing and that other thing, then I don't have to go to the other store. We call these spillover effects. Once you get hooked on one thing, you're likely to explore more things. So that one thing after another, if you engage with one country on a regular basis, in the long run, you're gonna develop very strong relationships. And the second approach is intergovernmentalism. The idea is that it's not really the consumers that cause this. It's really the governments. If there is a good vibe between the governments of 2 countries, they'll make anything possible, particularly big countries. Does Canada really matter? Mexico and the US are the ones that matter. We're talking hundreds of millions of people. So if Mexico and the US want something to happen, then Canada is going to have to go along. So that is the idea. So look south if you're in the US, and the Canadians will have no choice. They'll be afraid to be left alone. So the idea is big countries matter more than little countries, and the governments of the big countries matter the most because they're the ones who call the shots. And they will decide, the US will decide that we're gonna have a free trade agreement with Mexico, and then Canada can decide if they wanna join or not, and they chose to join. So that's how we had NAFTA, and now the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. So how does that affect a country's international economic relations, and how does that really play into economic warfare? And that's now what we're going into. So start with the US, and I'll be focusing on the US for obvious reasons, but I do have a couple on other countries. So the US engaged in economic warfare, as we mentioned, during World War II, but continued to do so during the Cold War, mostly to target some adversaries, to weaken them, in particular China and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union throughout China, starting in since the revolution until the 1970s. There's a really interesting change in policy to China. And the key for China is not to let the government organize the economy, to see if it would be possible to stifle the Chinese economy so that China would never be able to be a prosperous country, and that would discredit communism. With Russia, the Soviet Union, well, it was too late for that. Soviet Union was powerful, was a serious contender. So the idea is not to give them technological advantages that could be used for war against the US. So how can you deprive the Soviet Union from accessing American technology that the Soviets could then use against the US? But the US has really engaged in economic warfare against many other countries. Cuba has been the main target of economic warfare for the US, ironically, more than the China. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Chile, Nicaragua, so you have many countries out there. The way that the US engaged in economic warfare changed radically since the 1970s. So I want to talk a little bit about that. It changed radically because the CIA started to engage in these operations quite willingly, happily, in plain sight. So the CIA played a very important role in the overthrow of a president in Chile. He was democratically elected, but he happened to be the president representing the Communist Party. It was not part of US foreign policy to elect communist presidents around the world. So the CIA was given instruction to make sure that that didn't happen. There was a coup. Ironically, Chile had one of the longest histories of democracy in the Western Hemisphere, but that coup in 1973 led to a very brutal dictatorship. And there was a lot of opposition to this policy in the US. Does the US have the right to terminate 200 years of democracy in one country just because they elected a leader we don't like? So that led to a lot of oversight by the legislature and the houses of Congress, passed legislation, making it harder and harder for the CIA to get away with these things. Something similar happened in Nicaragua when the revolution succeeded in Nicaragua that put an end to 3 generations of leaders, to almost a century of dictatorship that the US supported. The US engaged in economic warfare. For example, Nicaragua was trading, there was an economic embargo on Nicaragua, and CIA agents in Nicaragua basically sunk some of the vessels that were used for Nicaragua to trade. A case went into the courts, and the US all the information became public. So because of that, the US took a step back. And the way that the US engaged in economic policy, economic warfare, was a little less hands-on. Less hands-on than in Chile and Nicaragua. I was going to go down the route, but I won't because we need to get back to the present. Okay, so the US has actually not hesitated to use economic warfare against our allies, against the European Union in particular. In the 1980s, the US passed sanctions against any company, American subsidiary in Europe, that engaged in trade with the Soviet Union. So many of these companies claim were registered in the EU. Well, at the time, it wasn't called the European Union, the European Common Market. So we're free to trade. The country that I'm based in has trade with the Soviet Union, so it's okay. The US said, no, it's not okay. You're the subsidiary of an American company. If you do that, there'll be repercussions. Your headquarters is in the US, and we've got you under control. So the goal of that is to prevent these companies from selling anything to the Soviet Union that the Soviet scientists could actually break apart and copy the technology. Again, the obsession was with the development of weapons, space programs, etc. The CIA went as far as to blow up a pipeline. Starting in the 1960s, the European Union started to get, or countries in Europe started to cozy up to the Soviet Union on the grounds that the Soviets might be here to stay. We can't just live in a permanent state of war with them. You know, the Americans can afford to do that because they have an ocean between them. But for us, think about Berlin. They're on the other side of the wall. I mean, we have to find a way to develop friendly relationships. And one of those ways to develop friendly relationships is to import hydrocarbons from the Soviet Union, something that is very much in the news today, something that the US government didn't like. So as those the pipelines were built from the Soviet Union to Europe, the US bombed them so that they would spill the hydrocarbons. So that's an act of economic warfare. The US was not interested in Western Europe getting cozy with the Soviet Union. After 9/11, the US has been very clear that economic warfare is common. The US is engaging in this, and I'm going to send you an email. It's coming tomorrow, but they're engaging in this on a regular basis as a preemptive measure to prevent further escalation of conflict. So we see that starting in the 2000s, it increased tenfold. I really want to call your attention to a very prominent form of economic warfare, SDNs, especially designated nationals and bloc persons. This has become common in the 2000s. What this means is that rather than declaring economic warfare against a country, you declare warfare against some of their leaders. So instead of trying to keep the Soviet Union, Russia in this case, from getting food, because then poor people would suffer, you basically go after the assets of Vladimir Putin and the plutocrats that putting in power that keep him there. So that is the idea. So the US and normally the European Union can selectively go after the assets of the Bank of Russia that are held in the US, or after the assets of Vladimir Putin, Roman Abramovich, and all those people. And there is legislation that makes that possible. It was passed in 1976. More than 6,000 people have been the subject of these sanctions by the US from 20 different countries. And it is illegal for any of us, anybody who lives in this country or anybody who carries an American passport, to deal with them. So no help from any of us. The US can freeze their assets. Normally the US cannot confiscate their assets, but they can certainly freeze their assets. Russia, China, many countries, they have lots of hard currency in each other's central banks. So in order to facilitate transactions, so that's the US. Not all of the money that comes from the US to Europe literally goes across the Atlantic. They keep each other's money in those coffers. What happens, and so does Russia, is it's heavy. Gold is heavy to move, so it costs money to take it from one place to the other just to be brought back. So countries have pots of money stored in each other's central banks around the world. And when the US decided to pass sanctions on Russia, they froze the money that that Russia has in the US and in Western Europe as well. And Russia can do exactly the same thing. The US and Western Europe also have liquid assets in Russia to pay for the hydrocarbons or anything whenever it's needed. We keep it there because we know they're going to be buying more and more and more, so it doesn't make sense to bring it back then to carry it over again. So the US has engaged in what some people call extraterritoriality. Does US law apply within the US only, or can the US apply it outside of the US? This is actually something that the courts are still discussing. But the US has really applied this SDN policy to non-US nationals. So about 10 years ago, a French bank, BNP, the Bank of Paris, the National Bank of Paris, was proven to have engaged in financial transactions with countries that the US did not want anybody to engage in transactions with: Cuba, Iran, and Sudan. And that bank had assets in the US. That bank had operations in the US. So the argument is that some of the money that you're taking out of the US is going into those countries where we're not really, we don't want the money to go, because we're really trying to strangle those governments. So $9 billion is a lot of money, even for a bank. So this is a policy with teeth. I have a few graphs that I want to show you here that shows the magnitude and the use of these economic warfare. They're all coming from the article that we read, so they're there in case you want to go back to it. But what we see here is that some countries, a few countries, concentrate most of the sanctions. At the very top is Cuba, Iran, Iraq, and all the way down to Nicaragua. So we see that, some countries get sanctions passed against them at some point, and they're still going decades later. A more telling graph, I think, is this one, is how much they have increased in the last 20 years. As I mentioned, after 9/11, the use of economic warfare has increased in the US, and this graph makes it very clear that it has. And we can see that in the last few years, the lighter color at the top is the number of sanctions that are approved every given year. So we do see that between 2017 and today, that the number has increased. I mentioned earlier that the effectiveness of these sanctions is not always clear. And the next graph, also taken from the reading, basically gets that. And it shows that those that seek to promote the protection of human rights tend to be more effective than those that try to solve a territorial dispute. Some countries engage in economic warfare against another because they claim that they occupy territory that is not theirs. Or when it comes to bringing down a regime, normally economic warfare is really not going to bring down a regime that you don't like. It hasn't been very effective. But even ugly regimes will make some concessions in terms of human rights when pressured by economic sanctions. So depending on what the policy goal is, there might be more success or not. The US engages very willingly. We can see that about a third of the actions that qualify as economic warfare are done by the US. So the US alone is very active. And the US does it in terms of national security. We mentioned to keep nuclear weapons out of the hands of those that the US believes shouldn't have them. Also because of terrorism, this is clearly a post 9/11 idea. And also for the protection and promotion of human rights and good governance around the world. Those are normally the three reasons why the US will invoke this kind of economic warfare. Okay, let's talk about another country that has become the target of some of these sanctions, Russia. So Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia engaged in a very aggressive campaign to develop their oil and natural gas fields. They saw that as an opportunity to achieve economic development fast, to generate revenue, so that they could actually keep a very large country from breaking apart and to keep people within moderate living standards. That was the idea. But for Russia to develop those fields, they needed to have willing buyers. Western Europe was ready to do that. We mentioned that they had a couple of pilot projects that went back to the 1960s, 1970s, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Western Europeans saw this as an opportunity to further bring Russia in, to integrate Russia into Western Europe. They sell us gas, they sell us oil, and then we'll sell them anything else, even technology they might need to get it out of the ground. So, Russia does engage in economic warfare as well. Unlike the US, Russia normally engages in economic warfare against countries that say bad things about Vladimir Putin. So regime survival is one of the key goals of Russia's foreign policy. And whenever a country that is economically vulnerable voices opposition to Vladimir Putin or his regime, then Russia might actually engage in their own economic sanctions. And they've done that normally against Western-style liberal democracies. Those are normally the targets of Russian aggression. And that is not a surprise, as you would expect. Another target is the countries that question Russia's foreign policy. When Russian troops march into a neighboring country, if a country voices opposition, they will likely face sanctions from Russia, economic warfare. That was the case with Estonia, the Latvian country, the countries on the North Sea, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Whenever they voiced opposition to Russia's invasion of Georgia over a decade ago. In 2014, when Russia tried to annex the Donbas region, Crimea, etc. So whenever these countries voiced opposition, Russia engaged in very aggressive economic warfare, including cyber attacks and other kinds. So those are really two clear patterns that we see. You really try to bring down Vladimir Putin's regime, or you say bad things about them, you might be the target of sanctions from Russia, or you question Russia's foreign policy. Targeting Russia's hydrocarbons is not necessarily a bad idea, because that policy has been very successful. Russia now has become very dependent on its exports of natural resources, not just hydrocarbons, but hydrocarbons play a very important role. And about 80% of Russia's export revenue comes just from the exportation of natural resources. That's the main source of revenue. So it is very important. So the European Union, as I mentioned, had a lot to do with this because the EU was very willing to engage with Russia, and they were willing to help Russia develop in this direction. They saw this opportunity to get access to cheap gas. The European Union suffered a lot during the oil embargo in the 1970s. Inflation was really high there. Countries had to come up with alternatives. So for them, developing new relationships with Russia was a way to bypass the Middle East, or at least to lower dependence on the Middle East. So not only would a friendly Russia be a reliable source of energy, it would also make Russia more likely to like Western Europe, or so that was the idea. When Russia invaded Ukraine last year and the European Union decided to halt imports of Russian hydrocarbons, China and India jumped in because the amount of oil that was no longer going to the EU collapsed at the price of oil and gas from Russia, and China and India had no trouble buying it at a discount. So the result of that is that the embargo hasn't quite been as effective as you would have expected, because the pipelines that run to the west are now dry, but there's all kinds of tankers moving that oil from Russia to India and China. More on that in a second. So this is also a table from the article, the essay that is included in the Great Decisions booklet. So this comes up with a list of sanctions on Russia. So I don't want to go through all of these, but I do want to call your attention to a couple of them. The second one is the asset freeze of Russian central bank assets. As I mentioned, you know, you might think it's hard to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank. No, because many of those assets are in DC. Many of those assets are in London, and many of those assets are in Paris and across the European Union. So they belong to the Russian people, but the countries that hold those resources, gold or euros or dollars, are keeping them there, and they're not allowing Russia to access them for transactions. So Russia cannot buy anything with them. Another one is that number three is the fact that a number of Russian oligarchs have been added to the list of personal sanctions. Oh, I think I just muted myself. No, I think the battery might have died. Is it back on? No, I think, is it back on? Yes, it is. Okay. I think it's starting to fail, but let's see if we can make it through. Yes. So might be a cyber attack from Russia. You never know. They're very good at this. Okay, so they'll be punching my tires. Oh, I think it died again. Don't mess with Putin. Do we need to replace the battery? Do I keep going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just speak really, really loud.
Really loud. Okay, you want the whole thing?
Unfortunately.
Yes, okay. All right, so I'll speak very loud. Can you hear me at the back? Maybe I wasn't speaking with a mic after all. It was just me projecting the voice. Okay, so one important goal is SWIFT. If we look at number 4 there, is limit access to SWIFT. SWIFT is the mechanism that is used by financial institutions to transfer money from one country to another. If you have to send money to a different country, your bank will have a code, the US has a code, the country that you're sending it to has a code, and the bank has a code, and then there is the bank account. So that is all regulated, so there is no two codes that are the same. So every country has to have one to allow for money to come and go. If you shut down the code for Russia, then Russia cannot be a part and parcel of those transactions. So that means that the Russian financial system has to work on whatever assets they have within or with the countries that are willing to violate those rules. Okay. So what you just saw is what the goal of the sanctions is, to crash the Russian economy. But it's not working very well. Because the export of coming from Russian hydrocarbons has fallen, the amount of hydrocarbons that are being exported. But because the retirement of so much oil and so much gas from Western Europe has increased the price, that one works very well. Yes.
Funny with few batteries.
Yes. So the result of this is that the price has increased. So the result is that Russia is actually generating more revenue. So we don't know where this is going to go, but so far the energy embargo hasn't been as effective as expected. In part, as I mentioned, because China and India have been willing to buy at a discount, and then with time the price of energy has increased anyway. So even by selling less, they can produce more. Keep in mind that the G20 economies account for 85% of the world's economy, and half of them are not part of these sanctions. So we tend to think that the world is on board, but most countries are not really engaging in economic warfare with Russia. Certainly not India, not China. We're talking about more than 2 billion people right there. That's a significant part of the world. Another problem that we might have in the making is that because of the increase of price of energy, we might actually find ourselves dealing with long-term high energy prices, which will cause long-term inflation in this country, and that could lead to a recession. So if the world stopped buying hydrocarbons from Russia, if China and India didn't, it is estimated that the price of a gallon of gasoline would increase to $12. And you can imagine that an economy where the price of gasoline is $12 is probably not going to do very well unless it is Denmark, where taxes are very high and people don't drive a whole lot because they like to bike. So we're really talking about a very difficult case scenario. We call this the boomerang effect. Sanctions by the US and Russia actually come back and have a negative impact on the US. So I've been talking about the European Union. It's very hard to decouple, just to use the term that is being used these days, the US from Russia, from the European Union when we talk about economic sanctions and economic warfare. Because part of what we see today is the result of a German policy of Ostpolitik, opening to the East. This was done aggressively since the 1960s by Germany, on the idea that if the Americans are really serious about protecting Western Europe from Russia, they might be ready to go to nuclear war. But if they do go to nuclear war, what's going to be left of Germany? Is that what we want? So this was the kind of rationale that was going on in Europe. So if the Americans do it, then we go to war, nuclear war. And if they don't do it, then the Russians march in. So what can we do? So the idea is that we need to start bringing the Russians in. We need to reassure the Russians that we have no intention of going to war with them, that if we work together, we are going to be better off. So that was the key goal of Ostpolitik. And when you listen to the news these days, you read that Germany has been dragging their feet. Normally, the countries closer to Russia and those on the western part of Europe, plus the US, have been very aggressive about the need to engage in a serious confrontation with Russia, but not so much Germany, because this is an end of a policy that Germany developed in the 1960s. When countries come up with policies, those policies have long-term effect. You don't have a policy one day to change it the next day, and certainly not if you're German. So if the policy is developed in the 60s and works, you stick with it. So it was very, very difficult. It's very hard sometimes to understand why the Germans are dragging their feet, and it's because of these. So again, the idea from Germany in particular that really pioneered these, and other countries in Europe that follow, is the idea of creating interdependence. If the policy goes well, the Russians will send us more and more and more and more energy. We'll buy more and more and more of it. So we'll become more independent from other volatile sources of energy in the world, and the Russians will love it. And they will see that we are willing partners, and they're not going to go to nuclear war with us, so there is no need to worry about that. So we build mutual trust and further cooperation. So this all was questioned when Russia started to send troops into neighboring countries. We saw that when Russia took parts of Georgia in 2008, when Russia facilitated the troubles in Ukraine in 2014, and then what happened last year and what we're dealing with today. So for that reason, the European Union decided to try to make it harder for Russia to continue to move in this direction, precisely by reversing the Ostpolitik policy. Okay, if you keep doing this, we're not going to buy your energy. But that was very, very timid, especially when Russia caused trouble in Georgia. The EU got a little more serious in 2014, and now it got really, really serious. Now the problem is that full decoupling from Russia is going to have very serious consequences. When this happened, Germany was even building a second pipeline to connect to Russia, to import more Russian energy. So the news last week suggests that the bombing of those pipelines that happened late last year, might have been done by Russian undercover agents. Intel suggests they might have been pro-Ukrainian saboteurs. The idea they did it, from what we know, they did it to try to provoke the West into conflict with Russia. But we don't know exactly who's done it. Intel is not very clear. But now the direction we're going is that they were pro-Ukrainian agents, not sure what agent really means, if they were working for a country, if they were working for Ukraine, or if they were just independent lone wolves. We don't know. So the sanctions that the European Union has passed against Russia will be incredibly familiar to you. And this is the point I really want to drive home. The US and the European Union are actually coming together. They're converging, and they're really coordinating their policies. So if you look at the screen, you're going to see pretty much what I just went over when we discussed the US. A couple of things I want to call your attention to is the EU is equally concerned about getting technology into Russia, because of they're afraid that Russia will then use it to continue to cause more damage. They also are trying to ban imports that generate the most revenue for Russia. So we mentioned hydrocarbons, but also steel, gold, some others. The service ban and the financial ban are particularly important. Most Russian corporations and Russian elites, they park their wealth in Western Europe. So if you really want to hurt Putin and those that work with them, creating ways to freeze their assets and to make their life miserable is, according to the Europeans, the way to go. So far, it's not happening as much as you would have expected. Food is excluded, and the main reason for that is the idea that when food was weaponized, poor people died. And the idea is that we don't try to make that mistake again. So the poor people are now the target, and the poor people of Russia, the poor people of Ukraine, is the oligarchs. And then China. China is a very interesting case as well, because China has become increasingly a practitioner of this game of economic terrorism, economic warfare. Not as much as other countries. The US does it more than China, Russia does it more than China, but China is catching on. So we'll see where this goes. So what's the backdrop to this? China decided to embrace the rules of international trade that I discussed earlier, the idea of non-discrimination against the goods and services of other countries, the use of elimination of all limits to trade, with the exception of some tariffs to protect some infant industries. So China really embraced the whole package. China joined the WTO. For China to join the WTO, it was a recognition that one, China was now a very strong developing country, and two, it gave China legal guarantees that it could sell their products across the world. And that was very important for China. China also saw the export of manufacturing goods in particular as part of its export-led strategy. This is very similar to what Japan did before China. South Korea did this, Taiwan did this, Singapore did this. We call these the Asian tiger model. The idea that they will become the factory of the world. They will start by producing very cheap goods that are not particularly good in quality, but they sell well, and then eventually build up at value added. So China just followed the same model that was already charted by other countries before China. To do that, you open up, you don't have the technology, you don't have the know-how, but you create incentives for those who have it to come in and invest there. And that was the idea. So bring in corporations from other parts of the world, they'll bring the technology, they'll bring the people with the college degrees, and they will teach the locals how to do this, and then you imitate. And sometimes you outright copy what they do. One of the problems with this is that in the 1990s and 2000s, China was clearly violating copyright laws. But because the basket where those copyrights issues were put was not moving very far because of farm subsidies, the legal tools that the US had to keep China from stealing American proprietary material were very limited. So what comes around, as a friend of mine says, goes around, or goes around, comes around. So it's very difficult. This is the idea of putting things in different baskets. If you approve this basket, then you can play with those rules. But if you don't approve that basket when you need to take things from that basket, then you don't have it. So this was a big problem that allowed China to pretty much copy and steal Western technology with very little repercussions. China also engages in economic warfare, and the main way that they do this is to deny countries access to the Chinese market. China says, oh yeah, you don't like my regime, and you don't like that I violate the rights of minorities, well, tough luck. Now, you just lost 1 billion consumers. So I don't really mind what you do in your country, you should not mind what I do in mine, but since you actually stuck your nose in it, now shut the window and you got caught. Okay, you're out. So that's normally how China deals with these things. They don't make a lot of noise about it. Yeah, they make it very clear. You pick my nose, you'll be sorry. So another important change is that as China has been adopting this technology and developing some technology of their own, they've been adding more value to their goods and their exports. So what we see is that China is moving away from producing cheap to producing quality. And now China is starting to have a problem with the weak protections of copyright issues because they have some proprietary material that some countries are stealing. So again, what goes around comes around, what comes around goes around again. It's the boomerang effect. What worked for China in the 1990s is not working so well because Vietnam and other countries are taking those technologies. China, regardless, needs energy. So the Chinese model in the 90s, when they became the factory of the world, they needed energy to power those factories. Today they do as well. Even if they produce microchips instead of cheap garments for Walmart, they still need energy to produce that. And China has become a very, very important innovator, particularly in some industries that China think are the future. For example, we talked a month ago about renewable energy, how China has become a leader in the last few years. And also, China has been exporting some of that technology to willing countries around the world, especially in low-income countries. So I'm moving to the end here, and I really want to call your attention to what I think is happening here. So I mentioned that we might not necessarily be at the end of globalization, but we certainly see a number of changes. And one of them is we see that the European Union and the US are starting to coordinate everything they do. So I wouldn't be surprised if the US and the EU were moving in the direction of further integrating their economies with more free trade agreements, along with their allies. These are the sanctions that both the EU and the US have passed against Russia right now, and some of them against China as well. So I'll talk about China in a minute. So we see in particular that the goal is to keep other countries outside of the EU and the US from accessing what they call critical and emerging technologies. These are technologies that generate incredible amounts of value added across the economy because they're used throughout. Think computers, think cell phones. And China produces a lot of those, but China does not have all of the know-how and the technology. They need to import a lot of it from the West to then put it all together in the computers. So keeping China and Russia from accessing that is a strategy to keep them from developing in the direction they're going, at the pace they're going, and also from using against the US and the European Union, when conditions are as critical as they are right now because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're talking about large capacity batteries. If we move in the direction of renewables, and China is really moving very fast, and we do solar and wind, we need to store excess energy so that we can use it when the wind doesn't blow and at night. Pharmaceuticals as well. We saw with COVID that the companies that developed the best vaccines were in the West. But China also developed their own. They were not as effective, but they did. So keeping China from having access to that has been very critical. Biotechnology in general, artificial intelligence in general, computing, financial services, all of that. If the US and the EU are serious about engaging in economic warfare with China, we're talking about pretty much half of economic trade with China would be affected by it. Because the US produces the technology, but then they send it to China for final assembly, and then it gets shipped back to the US. What that means is that the US will have to find another place to put that together. It could be within the US, it could be somewhere closer, but it won't be in China if things are moving in this direction. These are the areas where the US and the European Union are particularly concerned. Military technology, satellite technology, sounds like the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I mean, in a way, it's amazing how some things just keep coming back. Semiconductors, that's a different one. And on the semiconductor, you can see that China a couple of days ago issued a statement, a foreign policy statement, arguing that the Western economic warfare is not going to be fun because many of their industries are hurting as a result. And if they don't ease up, China is going to start playing their own game. There is one company in the world, and one only, this company called ASML, it's based in the European Union, that makes the most advanced machinery to make chips, microprocessors. Only that company has the latest technology. And China doesn't have access to it because it's based in the European Union and it's part of the European Union ban. So it's not going there. So the US is very happy with that. The US would like that technology to come here to produce those in the US. Some of you might have followed the news about the plant that was coming to Kenosha, so that could be revitalized if that were to come. But that Dutch company in particular that had the most cutting edge technology in the world has become the target of it, without the people in the company having anything to do with this grand strategy that is going on around them. So for them, this is not good news because they're losing money, because they can't send it to China, but other countries don't have the facilities to actually put it to work. So we have the most advanced technology, and the company might go out of business unless we do something to fix this problem. So the boomerang effect, what goes around, comes around, what comes around, goes around. So, and just to as a friend of mine puts it, to terminate. So are we talking about decoupling from Russia for China? If so, where is production going to be? So we have the brain power to come up with these ideas, but then we ask the Chinese to make them and then we send it back. Then if we are really decoupling from China, we're going to have to find a place to make it. And a few weeks ago, Janet Yellen said, we need to start friendshoring. Offshoring is the idea of shipping production to the places where production costs are lower. But her argument is that, see what happens when the places where you do that are not particularly friendly. Now you find yourself vulnerable to those countries. So instead of offshoring just about anywhere, you nearshore or you friendshore. You basically work with countries that you trust and you facilitate those investments going into those countries. That is not free trade. But the argument is that when the economy gets hijacked by politics, then you might as well play the same game for the same rules. So I conclude with a few ideas here. So where are we at today? I think we're witnessing the realignment of international economic blocs, in part because of the growth of economic warfare. The EU and the US have found themselves on the same side, coordinating their policies, and it's not clear who the enemy is. Russia, China, both, India. Where is India? India is asked to pick, and India is picking both. So So these are some really important realignments that we see today. Will that continue in a post-Ukraine world? We don't know, but we certainly start to see things. And the more that the Ukraine conflict continues, the more the sanctions on China and Russia continue, the more likely this decoupling is going to be. And once you get to what we call path dependency, once you build a factory to produce those microprocessors, say in South Carolina or in Mexico, you're not going to bring it back to China anymore. So then, your economy has changed. Another conclusion is that economic warfare is common practice. We say that it's an exception to the rules, but it's an exception that gets used on a daily basis. So how exceptional is it? So countries seem to think that we all have extraordinary circumstances that we face on a regular basis. We see that escalation is possible. The question mark is, will it escalate all the way to an actual military confrontation? It normally doesn't. But most military confrontations began as economic warfare. So certainly the possibility is there. We move in the direction of nearshoring, friendshoring. And here, this is my last slide before I thank you. These are some of the questions that the author of the article wants us to think about based on what he argues and a few other things that I argue. Is economic warfare effective? Is it effective as a tool of foreign policy? What do we do when there is innocent lives that get lost, or when civilians actually hurt because of the pursuit of high politics? How do we feel about the fact that only the president gets to decide what those sanctions are without any oversight from Congress? We might think, oh, it's okay when my president is in charge, but what if it's the other? Well, maybe that's not a good idea. And if that's a problem, then we do have a serious problem. So it's executive overreach. So how far is the current confrontation with Russia going to go? How far are we willing to go? Are we willing to go as far as paying $12 for a gallon of gasoline? And what happens if China joins in? Then we have two big enemies out there. And with that, I thank you for being here today. I appreciate your patience, and I'm ready for your comments and questions that you might have. Thank you very much, and thank you those who are listening from home. And we survived the cyber attack.
We did.
Yes.
Just a couple batteries, and it was solved. We have a very short amount of time for questions and answers and comments. So, people online, people in the room, ask your questions, but try and keep everything as brief as possible so we can cram things literally into 10 minutes, because that's how much we have. So anyone has a question, hands up, and Linda will scoot towards you with the microphone. Also, if you wanted a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, tgadzinski@manitowoc.org. Spelled exactly how it sounds. Or just call the library and ask for the marketing guy.
I'm interested to know the impact on citizens where the economic sanctions are in effect. And reading a publication that said, for example, it said in Iraq, the impact on the general population, and I think it cited millions of people having virtually died as a result of the, no food. And are those considerations factored into, when we apply sanctions?
Those are results of sanctions. So that's one of the questions that is raised by the author. When the president says, I'm going to apply these sanctions on Iraq, if the Iraqi people don't have access to certain medicines, people will die. This happened with Cuba as well, but Cuba has developed a very strong pharmaceutical industry. That doesn't make up for some of the cutting-edge medicine pharmaceuticals out there, but certainly Cuba has done fairly well. But I'm sure that many Cubans are losing their lives for not accessing medicine that is available in other countries. So there's evidence that happens, but that's what policy is all about. It's about making collective choices, and in the end of the day, politics is about living together for our own survival. It's about life and death. We've chosen to live in a society because we believe that it maximizes our chances of surviving, otherwise we're living alone. But that means that when our society is threatened by other societies, we do really nasty things to them. Is that okay? That's the question that the author argues. And we do know that economic sanctions cost the lives of people. That's a fact. Is that the right thing to do anyway? That's an ethical question that should inform people's thinking when they vote. And maybe, it should lead to further, reform so that the president can make those decisions arbitrarily, so that they have to be approved by Congress. So that's what's on, that's what's at stake. I think there's a couple of hands, one here and one over there.
Well, related to that,
Could you please hold the microphone to your mouth, please?
related to that, if a country it has sanctions against someone and it's hurting this other country, is it illegal for anyone in that country, let's say the US, to privately do something or go through a roundabout way with a volunteer organization through another country? Or would you get in a lot of trouble for doing that?
Well, we learned what happened with the French bank, $9 billion fine. So any American that violates any of these sanctions is liable. You can go to jail for a number of years and you can pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines.
Okay.
So do it willingly, but there might be consequences. It's the law. Nobody's above the law. I think there was another hand here to my right.
Yeah, for most of the world, they don't see they don't see that China, Russia are hostile to the United States, but the United States and then the West are obsessed with control and dominance, and they don't care how ruthless they can be. That's how most of the world see it. But I have a question about an event that took place in the Global South, in Latin America. I think it's a multinational organization in the regional organization called SEMTAC, that they tried to develop with Brazil. It was the sponsor, a regional currency. I don't know if you heard about this. It makes me wonder if this regional currency for trade among themselves is just basically to shield themselves from any attempt of the United States got the clause and start sanctions and things like that. I don't know if can you tell us about something about this?
Yes, I mean, Brazil, Lula da Silva has become the president of Brazil, and he's made it one of his foreign policy initiatives to create a South American currency within Mercosur, along with Argentina and other member countries. So that is the idea, similar to what the European Union has, similar to the US dollar that is used by other countries around the world. And the idea is by having a single currency, the economies become more dependent, trade becomes cheaper because you don't have to exchange money, you don't have to go to a bureaucrat and pay a fee to convert it. That is the idea. Whether that's an anti-US, anti-imperialist US policy, I don't know the answer to that. I think the idea is to bind the economies together to make them more interdependent and to lower transaction costs so that they can integrate their economies and trade more freely. The idea is that then they don't have to import from other countries, from third parties. They can stimulate trade within the member countries.
Something like the euro?
Yeah, something similar to that, yes. The problem with that policy, I don't want to get too much into the specifics of Latin America, is that Mercosur was there before. In the 1990s, they had a currency peg. So countries agreed to coordinate their policy. But at some point, the countries individually began to devalue the currency. And that really hurt their neighbors, because by devaluing, then your exports became more competitive all of a sudden and you hurt your neighbor. So the history here doesn't help. The history of mistrust and competition. So Lula has ambitious goals. We'll see how far he goes. But if you look into the 1990s, the precedent that led to the financial crisis is not very positive. Yes.
My question is, with all the problems we've had rebuilding our economy due to supply chain issues, doesn't it make sense to produce as much as you can locally or regionally, aside from international and political issues, to produce locally?
Well, that's one of the arguments that Janet Yellen is pushing. You can't produce everything locally. Where are you going to grow pineapples here? I mean, if we want pineapples, so there's limits to what we can do here. But the idea is we bring it closer to home, then we're not at the mercy of these countries that might use trade for these reasons. So in principle, that's the idea, but production costs, labor costs are much higher in the US. So bringing production home means that we have to be willing to pay a higher price for a number of things. So there's a trade-off to every policy that we make. There is an economist called Danny Roderick who's been calling for some form of protectionism. He claims that globalization has pretty much gone so far that the additional gains from more liberalization are very, very small. So he actually calls for countries to be strategic, to protect their economies strategically, to protect sectors that are really important for a number of reasons. Could be social, could be economic, etc. So, but certainly that issue is on the table right now. I mean, a few years ago, nobody would have considered that, but now the US and the European Union are very seriously considering this.
With all the empty factories, including one on Washington Street, it would seem to me to make a lot of sense to produce locally. What have we got to lose?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's up to, so there's definitely, here in Wisconsin, there's a lot of potential. I mean, the workforce has been trained for manufacturing, so there is that. So we certainly have a very strong basis to build on here. But is it the government that want to decide where production is going to take place? That would be a violation of international rules, which we have already heard the governments seem to be more willing to violate. So we'll see. It seems like we're really moving into a new era. So we'll see where that takes us.
And unfortunately, that brings us to our conclusion. We have officially run out of time for the evening. So thank you very much again to Professor Toral for giving us a lecture with a lot to unpack and a lot to chew on. Another round of applause for Professor Toral.
Thank you.
You can join us next week if the weather will cooperate. We'll be discussing war crimes with Kevin Kelly from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Law School. So thank you for coming tonight, and I hope to see everyone, plus more people, next week with better weather. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Safe travel.